resume. He has been working in chemical engineering with Falconbridge. He was here for Lakefield Research for many years. Many of you will know him. And many of you probably worked for him. Or maybe some of you, I don't know. He's now very, very busy. I think in the last 2 months he's been several times to Europe. He's been, I think, to Africa, China, the United States, and today he was in Toronto. And he rearranged his schedule to get back to speak with us tonight. We are very, very fortunate to have Larry Seeley here to speak with us tonight.
Thank you very much, Mr. Townsend. It's a pleasure to be here, and I certainly, we talked about doing it back in February, getting ready for it, and of course time goes on, and at the last minute I'm getting ready for it. so I spent some time today getting ready for this. So today I want to talk, I think, about what I think is my most favorite company in the whole world. Seeley is here, and she could probably give this talk just as well as I can. But essentially, and I'll ask for Seeley maybe to help me out at times, so I'm going to put my translate for it. I think this company has grown. I would say some of the outcomes, it's not all Lakefield Research and SGS now, but from what's spun up here, I would say about 2,000 jobs have been produced, and probably the sales in total of all the different groups is maybe 150 million. And these jobs are not only in Lakefield, but they're in other parts of the world. So what I'd like to do, though, is start back at the beginning. So we go back to Moses and move up. And this will be a story. It won't be necessarily a history, but it will be a story. And so that's what I plan to do. So the facts may not be quite, the years might be a little mixed up, and so on, but we can always go back and fix those sometime in the future. What I'll do is start with Falconbridge. GE's here, but Thomas Edison was partly involved in starting Falconbridge. He came to Sudbury because he needed copper, and essentially started drilling what is called the Falconbridge ore body. And he drilled it, but he never reached the ore body. He got apparently within 60 feet of it, gave up, and went back down to his other things he's doing. A person called Longyear came in and drilled it and found the Falconbridge ore body. At that time, finding the ore body was fine. It was nickel and copper, but there was a company, Inco, which is now Inco, had the smelting technology as well as what is called the Hibbernet process for refining nickel. So subsequently, an entrepreneur came in, a guy called, well, it's Dr. Thayer Lindsay. He came and he saw the opportunity for taking this ore body and changing it into products of nickel and copper. So working and developing the Falconbridge mine and subsequently building a smelter was not good enough. You had to have this Hibbernet process, which was developed in Sweden, or in Norway. It was a Swedish metallurgist who developed it in Norway, in Kristiansand, Norway. And he developed, the process was developed there, and then Inco got the worldwide rights to this process for producing nickel. And this is the only known process at that time. So Thayer Lindsay, what he did was he went and he bought that little pilot plant in Kristiansand, Norway. And by doing that, he got the rights to the Hibbernet process. And subsequently, then he came back and he built a smelter in Sudbury and built Falconbridge. I started Falconbridge up in 1928, moving into 1932. And he produced, the product from there is called a nickel copper matte, and most of the market at that time was in Europe. So so shipping this matte to Norway and subsequently, so a big part of Falconbridge became this refinery in Norway. So if you ask people in Norway, is Falconbridge a Canadian company? No, they'd say it's a Norwegian company. Because they've been there for about 78 years. So at the same time, Thayer Lindsay started Ventures. And Ventures has produced several mining companies in Canada. We have Giant Yellowknife, you've probably heard of, was started by Thayer Lindsay. Several gold companies in Quebec. Indusman, so the property up here was started by Thayer Lindsay, which got sold to Uniman, and which is the nepheline cyanide deposit. You'll hear me talk more about this. This is aluminum silicate, and it goes into the glass industry. So a lot of the ceramics that you see is probably produced from the aluminum silicate, or nepheline cyanide it's called here, in the United States or wherever it's being produced. But in doing this, so anyways, he started all these companies, but we'll talk about Indusman. He started Indusman, and so mining the property, he brought the ore down to this side of Lakefield. Because I won't go back into the cement, Canada cement and the history of that. You probably have heard of that before. But that was shut down in the beginning of the 30s. And so here they had facilities for grinding and crushing of ore. And so he started mining in Indusman, brought the ore down to the site, and of course he needed to have some lab work done. So he had size analysis done and some analytical work and quality control before this material was shipped down to the United States for changing into glass. Now over time, so this is into the 1930s now, and over time, he moved the operations of grinding and so on back to the Indusman site. But the lab continued for a while and continued in part. And at the same time, Thayer Lindsay, being as entrepreneur that he is, he was finding ore bodies or looking at ore bodies all around Canada. And so he started bringing samples into this lab for doing test work, analytical work, and then looking at how to extract the metals from these ore bodies. And so this little lab started developing capabilities. Analytical, started developing capabilities in mineral processing, looking at gold, looking at copper, looking at zinc, and so on. And perhaps just before going on, I'd just like to make the point that the reason Lakefield Research is here is because Mother Nature put every ore body different. So when you look at an ore body, the mineralogy of that ore body is generally different from one place to another. The minerals are, they could be coarse minerals, it could be fine minerals. They all intergrown. You can have different impurities, different concentrations. And so the process, every time you're going to produce something from this ores, needs to be developed. So no one can just go and get an ore and say, okay, we're going to build a plant. You've got to have this in-process in between of doing a whole lot of research on extraction. And so the lucky thing we have is Mother Nature put them all different, so that all this research and development, and that's what we've done here. Moving into the 40s, part of what transpired was during the war, bauxite was being brought in from Trinidad and Jamaica and producing aluminum in Quebec. So, and that still is happening, going on at the present time. But the Canadian government, Canadians and the U.S. in particular, were very afraid that the U-boats would sink and stop all the bauxite coming in and stop our aluminum production. So what was done by the Canadian government was they decided that there's a process of trying to reduce aluminum silicate, which is nepheline cyanide and Indusman, to aluminum. And it's a process using ferrosilicon. So this process was developed by Professor Pigeon, who was he became the head of the metallurgical engineering department of the University of Toronto. He's well-known, worldwide renowned metallurgist. And he developed what is called the Pigeon process. And this Pigeon process was developed in this little lab. There was, I think, 5 metallurgists, something like that, hired. And this process was basically being researched on at that time, back during the war. Of course, aluminum silicate, I don't know whether you know granite, sodium silicates, they're very difficult to break up into and produce metals from, thermodynamically, economically, and so on. So the process, while it worked, it was not economic. So after, the project was shut down after the war. But this process that was developed is used worldwide for producing magnesium. So in China, this fission process is being used all over the place in China right now for producing magnesium. And that's one reason why we can't compete against the Chinese in magnesium, because they have this process and it's quite inexpensive when you look at magnesium. Anyways, the project stopped, but at that time, Thayer Lindsay was continuing to do his exploration. So you said in 1949 there were 6 people in the lab, something of that nature. And so subsequently, mineral processing, looking at extraction of different minerals and bringing in different ore bodies, for him in particular. So we kept the lab going. But in addition to that, somewhere along the way, Gordon Scobie came along and became the manager, and at the same time developed the capability to go into contract research for various mining companies around the country, particularly Canada. Now, if I got my facts right, or somebody wanted to comment, then I'm a little bit wrong, because I'm going on hearsay more than anything here.
Well, we used to do ore dressing work for a lot of Vulcan Ridge's properties.
Yes.
From day one to
Yes.
the side.
Yeah.
And this was a grind. It was trying to get the right grind and the right process to get the maximum extraction from the ore.
Right.
And a lot of the processes for the gold mine was cyanide leach.
Yep.
So that's what we spent a lot of our time on.
So carrying on that, that's exactly what. When I say mineral processing, it's grinding, flotation, it's extracting of metals, and gold was one of the main areas, which is primarily, as you say, cyanide leaching and recovering gold. So the capability continued to be developed in the 50s for looking at this and contracting research, as well as with Falconbridge. But Lakefield Research was still under ventures. It was not part of Falconbridge yet. It was still under ventures in the 50s. So what transpired was that anyways, cost control was a big issue there, and then we move into the 60s, and in 1962, ventures merged with Falconbridge. So in 1962, that's when Lakefield Research became a division of Falconbridge. And at that time, I started doing a lot more work for the Canadian mining industry, and some of the work also was for Falconbridge. And during that time, the business continued to grow because of the number of clients that came on board. Going from Gordon Scobie, went to Harold Wisluzel. Harold Wisluzel, he had worked at Lakefield Research from quite a young age, and he became the manager. And subsequently, this is in the 60s, 70s, and into 1986, or 70s to 1986, grew to over 30 people. I think the capability continued to grow, particularly in gold, and develop more capability in chemistry. The mineral processing continued to expand, analytical chemistry, and getting into building pilot plants. So Lakefield Research has got the most capability now and then in pilot plants in the world. So when you go from a laboratory before you build a plant, you need to go through a pilot plant. And so subsequently small plants, and so those big sheds at the back of Lakefield are just full of equipment that get moved into pilot plants, and they're built, and after they're used, the equipment's put back because some of the equipment cannot be used for the next pilot plant. So it's continuously building and taking down pilot plants. At that time, there's hiring of various people you've probably heard of. Tony Bigg is an example, Keith Sarbuck, Rodney Williams, Bob Irwin, Brenda Patrick, Bert Carr, Shelley here, one that's been over 30 years or more.
Yes.
Yes. So, and the scope of services continue to broaden. but primarily servicing the Canadian mining companies and primarily servicing still mining companies in Canada, but they're still, starting to do work for properties in Africa, properties in South America, properties in the United States, and so on. Developed a tremendous reputation of being very competent, very knowledgeable, very cost-effective, and so on. Moving on through the 70s, so the process, primarily still mineral processing and analytical, but then moving into hydrometallurgical and gold, developing some mineralogy capability. About 1984, and this is when I started coming on the scene, Falconbridge decided to shut down their corporate research and development labs in Thornhill, Ontario. And at that time, I had been running at one time I ran the research and development in Falconbridge, then I ran all the operations, and the smelter in particular, and then I came in to look after the corporate research and development for Falconbridge worldwide. And so the facilities in Thornhill were being shut down and moved to Sudbury. But at the same time, some of the people preferred to come to Lakefield. Bob Buchan was one of them, I think, and various people in the analytical chemistry. And so the capability of the Lakefield research grew because of some of the people that came in from Thornhill, but also the Thornhill, as well as Falconbridge, were doing more and more work here. So there's a lot of interaction, and that's when Falconbridge got into diamonds, I think, back in the late 1970s and into 80s, and some of the work was started to be done in Lakefield, and then from there, we've got the biggest diamond lab, you might say, in the world. During that time, under Falconbridge, we had several presidents. So there was a president and a little small board of directors that the general manager had to report to, but people like Pete Berry, who was the vice president of technology at Falconbridge, a guy called Phil Thornhill was, I think, a director. He was the director of research and development at Falconbridge. Mr. Frank Pickard, he was everybody that was involved with Lakefield just loved the company, and Mr. Frank Pickard, he was a very big man, but he was vice president of technology at that time at Falconbridge, and he became CEO. You might remember he died in Chile and at Coahuasi when he went up to the height, but he was very important to where Lakefield is now as well. A person called Mike Amston was president for a while, and then it became myself in 1992. So I became the president of Lakefield too. In 1986, Dr. Bob Salter was hired to be the general manager after Bert Wisluzo retired. And he was very future-oriented and wanted to grow the company and expand the services, and he did. He grew what we call a hydrometallurgical division, an environmental division, both consulting as well as analytical, a plant services group, continued to develop the mineral processing, and also develop facilities. So during this time, the company, up until about 1992 or so, grew from somewhere in the range of 60 employees up to over 100 employees during this time. Is that right, Shelley?
Correct,
yeah. And so subsequently continued to grow that. In addition to that, he increased the capability, particularly in the technical capability of the company. We brought in a person called Dr. Joe Ferrone. He did his PhD in Columbia University, and he is now a worldwide guru in what we call hydrometallurgy. So we look at everything from gold to extraction of zinc or copper or just about anything from a hydrometallurgical point of view. So he led this hydrometallurgical group. Dr. Chris Fleming, you may have heard of him. He's from South Africa, and he worked all his life in gold. And I'll tell you how we got him, but anyways, he came in and he also to grow this group. Mark Tyndall came in administration from Falconbridge and continued to provide better services. Russ Cowell came in to look after the analytical and grew on his analytical department to, I think it's the best analytical department or group in the whole world with regard to not only geological analytical services, but others, and I'll get into that in a little bit here. Now, just before going on, before we get past 92, I'd like to go back to myself and what was going on at Falconbridge. So at Falconbridge, I personally had ran R&D, I ran the operations, and subsequently was interacting with Lakefield, and always felt Lakefield could be a company that could be built. You might remember there was a time when R&D was being shut down at companies. And one of the ingredients for business, or for extraction of metals, is R&D is critical. But if you're shutting it down, how are you going to be able to continue to operate? So you see this need not only in the large companies, but also the small companies haven't got the capabilities. So I personally saw Lakefield always as a company that could be grown. At the same time, we had a guy called Bill James, who, if you look in the early 80s, Falconbridge was almost a basket case financially. But he turned the company around and got it to be one of the strongest mining companies in the world, financially and so on. So we hit 1989 with this tremendous Falconbridge, good balance sheet, able to take on and just about do any projects in the world. And if you look at companies like BHP and Rio Tinto and Anglo American, we're of the same caliber as they were. In fact, with BHP we made even bigger. And the same thing with Inco at that time. But what happened in 1989 is we got taken over by Noranda. And I hope there's no press here because I don't have this. Anyways, one of the problems we faced was in this, Bill James, I just love working with him. He's one of these huge characters in the mining industry. But he did a deal in buying Kidd Creek Mines over the weekend in 1986. And Noranda wanted this Kidd Creek Mines very badly, but Falconbridge got it. So Alf Powis, who was the CEO and a very good friend of Bill's, he decided, well, we're going to buy Falconbridge. And so he subsequently went about it, and subsequently got 20% of Falconbridge, which he can do on TSX, and then started going after more. And so subsequently, Noranda took over Falconbridge. It was not just a direct takeover, it was 50% Noranda, and another company came in, 50% Trelleborg, which is a Swedish company. Took the company over and privatized it. So we went off the Toronto Stock Exchange and became private. And the reason I'm telling you this is because this all affects Lakefield eventually here. So in doing that, what it did was, the way it was done was banks were used to provide the money, and then after the deal, all the debt was put on Falconbridge. So we went from a very little debt to 2.3 billion in debt. And we had 1.5 billion in sales. So what happened, and we were told we have to pay back the debt. So there's financial groups behind us. I don't want to even name them. I don't think it's appropriate. So, but it's basically a financial management process of taking us over. But it stopped growth. It stopped projects, and our whole objective of life was then to cut costs. And the next thing was start selling divisions, and this is why we're Lakefield here. So we sold Falconbridge Copper, which was back to Tara Lindsay and all these copper projects that were brought into Falconbridge. We sold Falconbridge Gold. Kim Ross got Falconbridge Gold projects. We sold Ferrament, which was to the Japanese, which is in William. And we sold Innsmouth to unit. And so things started selling off to pay down the debt. And I've given lots of talks, or I might say over a beer or something like this, saying, this kind of a process should not be allowed, to use bank debt and then put it back like this, because it affects everybody's lives. It affects employees' lives, it affects jobs, it affects growth, and so on. But anyways, that's one of the things that can happen. I'm not sure. Anyways, at that time I was still in Sudbury. I was running the operations there, and so in '92 I was offered jobs to run Brunswick Mining and Smelting with John Carrington, who became CEO of Barrick. But I decided I didn't want to do that. Because of what's going on here, I want to get in Bay Street and see what the hell's going on in front of me. So I took a job as vice president of Falconbridge, which is a big job. I became an officer of the company. So there's 6 of us, and also president of Lakefield. So president of Lakefield was sort of the icing on the cake, and it wasn't a big part of the job because it was being run very well there by a general manager. So anyways, during that time, so this is 1992. At that time, we put Chris Fleming in as the general manager of Lakefield. And so he became the manager at that time. And we moved into a lot of strategic planning, quite a lot of, and then looking at where we're going to go. And the first thing that we decided on was to, just to give you some history on the mining. So mining was primarily Canada, Australia, US. And as soon as you moved out of that, you're into regions that they had very poor land tenure laws, they had poor environmental laws, they had poor laws with regard to foreign investment, poor laws with regard to just basic, having very high risk without very much capability. And the first country to open up was Chile, and that was in 1993. And a lot of people think it's been going on for a long time, but it's only 1993 when all this started to happen. And so Chile opened up, Pinochet, maybe just before getting into that, the reason we got Chris Fleming here was when I was president of the Canadian Metallurgical Society, I had a conference in Winnipeg. And so I got Bob Salter and Bert Wasluzzo to put on a symposium, in Winnipeg on gold. They brought people in from all around the world, and we got Chris Fleming from South Africa to that gold symposium, and subsequently started interacting with them, and subsequently we eventually convinced them to move from South Africa to here. And that's how Chris Fleming, who's been one of the major guys that are growing this company, got to Lakefield. But at the same time, in 1987, I was in Chile. I was giving a talk in Chile when Pinochet was still in charge. So this was the first Canadian-Chileno mining conference that ever been put together. So that was in 1987, 88. And Pinochet eventually let go of control and started democratizing the country, and then the laws started getting changed. So the land tenure laws started changing, the environmental laws got put in place, foreign investment laws, and all kinds of stuff. And so the first place Canadians started moving to was Chile, and so we decided to follow. That was one of our strategies, and just before going on further, I'd just like to emphasize what I think a lot of people do not realize is that Canadians and the Canadian mining industry were the entrepreneurs of the world in mining and metals. If you look at the Toronto Stock Exchange, probably 50% of the mining companies in the world are on the Toronto Stock Exchange, the big. And so when you went into a country, now if you went into a country like Argentina, you would find 40-50% are Canadian companies, 20% Australian, and then the rest are some 20% countries like Argentinian or others. So Canadians have been for a long, are the entrepreneurs of the world in mining and metals, but there's a big but because of the lack of support USA financially and otherwise over the last few years, the Australians are coming up very, very quickly. And so there's a good question now whether Canadians are ahead or Australians are ahead. But it's still the two, they're still primary people. So anyways, moving in, so we decided to move into Chile, and this is in 1993. And this is a story I don't like to tell, but so a guy called Mark Tyndall and I went down to buy a laboratory because you want to start off not with just, you want to have some base to start off with. So we decided that we went to Santiago and to buy a lab, which was for sale. And I gave myself 3 days to do this. And subsequently, guess what? We failed. I failed. Subsequently, we didn't give us enough time. We didn't, you need time in doing any deals like this. And subsequently came back and we were buying it from Anglo American, and Anglo American went and sold it to the manager. And so subsequently, here we are now, still wanting to move into Chile, but we didn't have a lab. And we want to be in Santiago, which is the center of Chile. So what we did is we did a startup. In fact, we got a building right next to this lab. And we started up. Started up with 3 people instead of having 50 people to start up with. And anyways, we started up with the first manager there was Keith Sarbuck. You probably, I don't know Keith, but so he started up this operation starting in 1993. And it was it's been our toughest story financially with starting up Chile. We lost a lot of money in Chile before we started making money. It's now very, very successful, over 100 people, but but anyways, that was in 1993. Moving on to 1994, so during this time we continued running the company, we continued strategic planning, we continued growing services. But I can tell you, when you're a division of a large company like Falconbridge, you can't grow very quickly or very easily. Because Lakefield's a service company, Falconbridge is a mining company. You've got money, we're putting it into mining, we're not putting it into services. And so getting cash for investment was very tough. So you always had a budget, you had all the cash would go back to the company, so you had a very difficult time of growing and doing the things you saw you should do, to grow the company. In 1994, the Random board, after selling off these others, decided that we should sell Lakefield, and so Falconbridge board then decided as well, and I was the president of it, and I had made it well known to Mr. Frank Pickard, who's now the CEO, who I'd worked for about 8 years, that I was very interested, along with management, to buy this company because we saw that, and it was the best place for it because we knew it, we could grow it, we could make it happen. So that was in August of 1994. We were notified that Lakefield would be sold. But what they decided to do was, instead of just selling it to us, they wanted to go through an auction process.
More money.
More money. And they brought in a person to assess the business and so on. At the same time, by this time, what had happened in Falconbridge, we had been a private company, but when we went into strategic planning in Falconbridge, there was only one problem, and that was our financial strategy. I mean, we were so far in debt, and we couldn't do anything, and all these opportunities they had. We had a Raglan project, which is a fabulous ore body, now is being mined in northern Quebec. We had this Collahuasi project in Chile, we had all these things, and you couldn't do anything because your financial strategy was such a mess. So that was what came out, and I remember presenting it to the board, that there's only one problem in this company, and this is what it is. And so it was within a few weeks after that action was taken to say, okay, we should sell off 1/3 more of the company and pay down the debt. But what transpired over that was CIBC World Markets became so interested in this that they decided, why don't you become public again, and we'll sell this publicly. So that's what happened. And that happened in 1993. This was the largest IPO that was done in Canada at that time. It was $1.3 billion was done. And so subsequently, Falconbridge became a very viable company again to grow. And started doing the Raglan project and started doing the Waiwasi project. But at the same time, wheels are in motion to sell Lakefield, the thoughts. And so it continued, even though it didn't have to, So the Waiwasi project's going, the Raglan project's going, and the deep mines in kids. So this kind of slowed down the process of auctioning in 1994 and in so we moved on and things went quiet, and at the same time I was getting prepared with Price Waterhouse and looking at financial modeling and all kinds of things, as well as our lawyers, Osler, Hoskin and Harcourt in Toronto, which is the largest law firm in Canada, one of the best anyways for sure. And working through a process to see how we could buy out the company. So this delays kind of helped me in getting that all together. And we moved on into the spring of 2005 now, or 1995, and subsequently the auction process was still going to start. And what I did was I went to Mr. Frank Pickard and said to him, why don't you let us make an offer for the company, because I think we'll pay more than anybody else. And if you don't like the price, then you can auction it. And so that's what we did, beginning of June of 1995, and by June the 30th, 1995, we had a deal. Of course, Falconbridge came back and negotiated the price up, but and it was by far more. We paid far more than I think anybody else would have paid, so it was not a gift in any way. At the same time, when we did this, myself, as well as Lakefield, as well as some of the people at Lakefield, as well as Falconbridge, was known by CIBC, and they saw this as a jewel, and so CIBC, I was going with the Bank of Nova Scotia because we didn't want this conflict of interest, because CIBC was Falconbridge's bank, and so we decided to go with Bank of Nova Scotia. But CIBC came in very, very strongly and said, look, Larry, we want to do this with you, and so basically financed us being able to run this company. And then we had 90 days. We didn't close the deal until September 30th. These deals are very complex. Definitive agreements, you get into paper this thick, it's for lawyers and all kinds of meetings, and negotiations, and lots of tough times to get through these things. The biggest problem that we faced over here was environmental, and that's another area that you probably have seen. So negotiating the environmental, because all those years, various things were done that were not proper, and so subsequently, we didn't know what our liability was, but we knew it was huge. But we primarily took it on. I think Falconbridge paid a little bit, but not. I would say it's probably in the 15% range of what it eventually cost us. We spent probably at least $3 million on cleaning up this property. So this was done by management, who are the main guys that paid for this, and cleaning up that property over the years. It's pretty good now. So we carried on. So anyways, we bought this in 1995, about 120 employees then. And so then we went into, again, strategic planning. I'm very much a believer in strategic planning. You either set new objectives of where you're going to go, or else you find that you can't get there because you haven't got the capability. So you have set objectives and develop the capability. So those two combined is always what we're doing in strategic planning. And through the process, we set in objectives and we set in growth objectives. I remember setting in an objective of I think it was doubling or tripling the revenue in 5 years, and everybody thought I was nuts. But anyways, we did it. But through those years, we continued growing the hydrometallurgical group till it became very large. I think 40, 50 people at that time, and it's much larger now. We grew the analytical department to well over 200, 250. And we grew, we started the mineralogy group, which, from my background in R&D, that, scanning electron microscopes, electron probes, and so we developed that, and that became then part of the diamond business as well. And right now, the facility's down, what's the name of street, Bridge Street, is it?
Yeah, by the West End Garage,
Yeah.
Julian Plaza.
Yeah,
That's
Julian Plaza. That whole facility in there with all those high technology QEM scans and so on, that's all of the output of this now. So that is probably the best mineralogical service in the whole world right now. And so BHP is sending things from Australia, etc. So we developed that. Just one interesting thing that you might want to hear about is during this time, I always saw water as being an area that is going to require more and more analytical service. And we had a person called Debbie Stogren, you might know of. Anyways, Debbie was very much a bulldog to grow this area, and started into developing the capability in the company. It wasn't very profitable initially. A lot of people wanted to shut it down, but I certainly wouldn't let it happen. And so subsequently, we carried on. And then what happened was the Ministry of Environment, you might have remembered, went on strike back in 1996. And all the municipalities of Ontario are getting all their water testing done at the Ministry of Environment labs, so all of a sudden have to meet the requirements of the government and laws, and they had no lab. And so subsequently, serendipitously, and Debbie was going after things, we started bringing in this business. And I think over a period of about 2 years, we started servicing about 60% of the municipalities of Ontario. Walkerton was not one of Lakefield's. But Walkerton, the last I heard, Walkerton is a client now. But it wasn't at that time. And so subsequently, that whole business was developed. Many jobs were produced. I think, just carrying on, we went from about 120 people to, well, around 350 people by about 1999. And this again is because now you're freed up to make financial decisions. You can grow the company, you can invest in this, you can invest in that, and so on. And when I say 350 people, I mean here. I don't mean the rest of the world. We became, like Barrick Gold, we became only Lakefield. We started developing capability in nickel laterites. So Lakefield Research is the lab in the whole world that works on nickel laterites. We developed capabilities in sophisticated pilot plants. One pilot plant there is in what we call autoclave pilot plants. It's a $2 million pilot plant in this facility. And I'll get into where we expanded around the world. We developed marketing capability, and we started up in the diamond business. And also we developed the environmental consulting business. Just to let you know, because in case I forget, the environmental consulting business was spun off by SGS about 3 or 4 years ago, and it's now Cambrian Environmental, which is in Peterborough. So they moved out in Peterborough, and I think there's at least 50 people in that business. A guy called John Desbian, who we brought in as a long-haired guy, as a technician. He's now the president of Cambrian Environmental. He's actually quite wonderful.
Still got long hair?
No, he doesn't. He's looking more like me. Anyways, so we continued. I think one time we took, from Trent, we took the whole graduate chemistry department. Everybody that graduated. I think Lakefield here is by far the largest employer of Trent graduates. And I don't know, Shelley, how many we got now? I mean, it used to be like 70 or 80, probably it's way more than that now.
Definitely more, yeah. I mean, some have left and gone, but I would say probably in the analytical particularly, that I would say 70% would be Trent grads, for sure. Great.
Okay, at the same time, so we're developing this here. At the same time, though, mining is opening up now, starting around the world. So after Chile, next country that became sort of opening up was Brazil. That started in about 1995 and started getting some of their laws in place. And just going back to Chile, I just want to make sure that you know, the Canadian mining companies going in there, Falconer's going in there. I wrote the environmental policies, I wrote the codes of practice. I found the codes of practice that I wrote in Chile when I went to Brazil, you know, so I just, you know, so what we did is we helped these countries, you know, develop their policies and codes of practice. So when you hear the Canadian, I mean, there might be one or two Canadian companies going in and messing up, you know, projects, but mostly it's not. It's the very opposite, much more, far more diligent than even the governments or even definitely the local people. I mean, so we set the policy, we set the standards, and because it's not only proper environmentally, it's proper economically as well. You know, cleaning up stuff, as we did here, is not the right thing to do. So in about 1997, 98, and so when our strategic plan, we say we're going to go here, we said Brazil, we're going to go to South Africa, we're going to go to Australia, because that's where the action is going, and but we just don't go there. We wait till we see opportunities in those particular areas, and we focus on where would be the best place to be. So we looked at we looked at Brazil, and Belo Horizonte, which is the third largest city in Brazil, is in the mining center. And they came to us as well as us going to them, and subsequently we formed, eventually over several months, we did a deal and formed a 50-50 joint venture. So we bought 50% of the company in this laboratory in Belo Horizonte, Brazil. It was an analytical lab primarily. We put in the management, so the people from here went to Brazil. Gene Richardson, as an example, worked there as a manager for, I don't know, a couple of years at least. And we put in the technology. So all our capability here, we took to Brazil in various analytical. It was 55 people when we started. I'm not sure what it is now, but it was over 250 people whenever we sold the company. And subsequently, it's the primary service in Brazil with analytical, and we also contract managed CVRD, which is now Valley. You've heard of Valley Inco. Valley had a big R&D center. We were the contract managers with employees with that, as well as an analytical department, about 100 people, and we also helped them develop their mineralogical capability. I think it's a tremendous operation, and I still feel the people that we work with in Brazil are best friends, and I think it's by far the number one lab in South America to put in place. So that's Lakefield Geosol. We went on as well in about 1998. This is, I think, around September-ish. We saw the need to move into Africa. Africa now was starting to open up again, starting to get laws in place, etc. But it's still very sketchy. We had many people coming to us wanting to go into Zambia or go into other places, and every time we looked at this is not the place to be. Yes, you may have a little lab, how are you going to grow this and so on. We said we had to be in Johannesburg, and so that's what we decided we were going to be. And that was early in 1997 or so we decided that's where we're going. Billiton decided to sell their lab. It was an analytical lab. But a company called SGS came in and beat us out. They paid 5 times more than we offered. So they got the land from Billiton. But just a few months later, Goldfields, you may have heard of Goldfields, it's a major company. And Gold decided to close they were going to shut down their R&D lab and going on to sell it. And within 2 weeks, we bought this fabulous facility in Johannesburg. And so subsequently, we bought it, we brought in the people. I think at that time that the people had been decreased to about 20. And we put in, I think, about $2 million worth of analytical equipment and started developing analytical and metallurgical services. And I still remember going there a few months afterward. There's 20 people, and they said, they thought they were going to be potentially shut down because there wasn't that much business still. And I said, no, it'll be 100 people then too. 2 years. And anyways, it's well over that, so it's at least 250 people now, I think, in that range. It might even be, you know, again, I'm out of touch, but it's become now the total analytical and metallurgical service in the Africa region. This is called now, it was called Lakefield Research Africa Limited. I'm sure it's called SGS now, but that's what it was. Primarily in gold and platinum, group metals. And in Africa, South Africa just started opening up, you know, into the 2000s and so on. So it's not something that could have happened before. But also, in the range of about 1998, 99, we decided we'd also had to be in Australia. So just to give you some understanding here, Lakefield Research, with the piloting capability, is almost without competition in many areas. The biggest competition was a company called Hazen Research out of Golden, Colorado. And but they were employee only. Their structure was they couldn't expand. They would have loved to join us, but they couldn't figure out how to do it. And so we saw in Australia these smaller labs, but they didn't have the total capability that was needed to meet the needs of all the mining industry and the new exploration that's going on. So this is through this growth period. And we looked at where we should be. We looked at Brisbane, which is on the east coast, a lot of mining. We looked at Melbourne, and we looked at Adelaide, but we decided Perth is the only place to be because Western Australia is where all the mining is and where most of the mining companies would be. So we bought a company called Ore-Test, and this is good, and it was one of the reasons why we ended up selling. Anyways, and they had about 35 employees, and subsequently, very good, right place, but we needed more business there. And at that time, BHP had come to me and wanted us to invest in their pilot plant capability for laterites. And I said, okay, we'll do that, but we'll only do it this amount, and we want this number of people in it. And their board decided that they didn't have the capability, that we should have this whole thing done by Lakefield. So this whole pilot plant that was, at that time, worth maybe $6 million at least, came into our facilities. And we that pilot plant now is owned by Lakefield, or by SGS. So I made a deal where over time it became, depreciated and became eventually Lakefield. But it became the center of doing nickel laterite research in the world. So these nickel projects, nickel cobalt projects, and grew to about 100 employees, and tremendous capabilities developed for processing downstream. So, companies like CBRD, when they're putting their nickel project in Brazil, it's going to there. Falconbridge now even goes there. BHP, everybody that's into the nickel laterite business is probably going to our facility. I'll get back to Ore-Test in a bit here. Next area I went to is Argentina, which again was, Argentina we lost, I'll tell you ahead of time, we lost at least $1 million before. It was a World Bank project where we're doing environmental baseline studies for the 5 southern provinces of Argentina. So the Patagonia region, we're doing flora and fauna and underground water, surface water. We're doing archaeology, etc. All the things you do in the environment. But things moved so slow there, and we had employees, that you couldn't get, first of all, you couldn't get paid very fast. Secondly, getting decisions. And so instead of the project being like 1.5 years or so, it dragged out to 3 years. And we eventually got it done. We eventually got paid in US dollars. But we closed the project. We had an office in Buenos Aires. And Argentina was not at that time the right place to be. It was more like Chile. And so we moved back out of Argentina. Just to let you know, Argentina did not start opening up to mining to well into the middle of the 2000s. And that's when we started getting their laws in place and the opportunities for investing and so on. So anyways, we continue to develop this and putting in new labs. Just to give you an idea, like in the analytical lab here, we got into, because we're so good at doing precious metals analytical work, we got into working with General Motors, and all the catalysts are doing catalytic converters, so the platinum, palladium, and so when people are providing, let's call it the coatings that go on these catalytic converters for General Motors, they want to make sure there's that much platinum, and that much rhodium, and that much palladium, and so on. And we became the testing center for General Motors worldwide, and then it moved on to Toyota, and then Honda, and Chrysler, and just about everybody. Goes to Lakefield Research for this service. And as far as I know, it's still going on. So it's so that capability we developed in mining got transferred into healthcare. And we also went down into the United States and helped them with their labs. There's some labs that we had to go and train people how to analyze properly. So we continued developing new labs. We grew Chile to about 70 to 100 employees now, I believe. We built 2 new labs. One was in Australia, which took a lot of cash, and we also built one $2 million new lab in Chile. So that was in around the 2000 to 2001 area. At the same time, working with Hazen Research in Golden, Colorado, we jointly owned a company called A.R. McPherson. And so I heard where we are, General Electric is developing all these motors for big grinding mills. Lakefield Research and A.R. McPherson is developing all the power requirements for grinding. So we're going through all the test work. So I would say half the mills in the world, the work has gone through probably this facility here, and determining what the power requirements for that ore. So the hardness of the ore and looking at every ore is different. And so what we ended up doing is we had a joint venture, but it was definitely better for Lakefield to own the whole thing. And so eventually we ended up buying A.R. McPherson out of Hazen Research. We had a good relationship for a number of years, and so now it's part of Lakefield Research. A.R. McPherson was a well-known engineer in Canada. I think he lived in Lakefield. You want to tell them all about it? Anyways, he used to come up, and he is world-renowned for grinding technology. At the same time, we started investigating in Russia. I went to places like St. Petersburg, Moscow, various places. We had other people travel all around Russia because we saw Russia as a place, particularly for analytical service. You might have heard of people like Barrick and other people moving in there. And I was going to be choosing St. Petersburg. Norilsk Nickel, which was the largest nickel company in the world, owned a company called Gypro Nickel, and they wanted us desperately to move in with them. But they had 600 employees, and we would have done the same revenue with 10 employees. So it was a bit of a problem. Since I see Marie here, I just want to make a point that back in that 1996 to 1999, Lakefield Research, with Marine's help, local Chamber of Commerce, helped us get the Excellence Award, Business Excellence Award for Ontario back in that period.
Very proud, very proud. A little late for us.
We also looked at Mexico. I was down in Durango, and we're going to set up a lab. Mexico, again, was a latecomer, just opening up like in 2000, 2001, 2002. You hear all kinds of things going on now, but again, if the laws are not in place, people don't go. And we were looking at other places like China, etc. Just to give you another area that we worked on during this time is diamonds. This laboratory, I think now is well, you have De Beers and then you have Lakefield, and I would say Lakefield is the largest diamond processing or analysis company in the world. Not only doing Canadian, but also outside of Canada. Right, Shelley? And just to give you an idea what's going on, so in diamond exploration, there's what is called indicator minerals. So these are things like garnets and rubies, and they have a certain chemical structure. And so what happens is all those ores come in, and we go through an analytical procedure where we get rid of most of the like quartz and all kinds of things. And we're left with these little, very, let's say 1% of the overall ore or sample that came in. And then we look for these indicator minerals, which are the garnets and so on. And then we go through this mineralogical test work of using scanning electron microscopes and so on to try to figure out the chemistry. And that chemistry will tell us whether we're getting close to where a diamond project is. In addition to that, we look for microdiamonds, because when you're looking for diamonds, you're not going to find very often a diamond. It's going to be very rare you find them. But what you find is microdiamonds, and the quantity of microdiamonds, so we're talking about very, you couldn't hardly see them with your eyes. They're very, very fine. And so the amount of microdiamonds starts telling you that this deposit could have diamonds. And then you get into larger and larger samples. And in addition to that, we put in big piloting equipment here for concentrated diamonds. So there would be like 50 tons of material come in, and we'll go through our diamond processing, to try to find diamonds. And diamonds were found here. And most of them, so like this project up in northern Ontario, that work was done here. Some of the projects out in Western Canada were done here, the ones in Quebec were done here. And now projects, I know when I was there, projects from Africa, United States, we sent down into the United States, one of the parts there had I forget which government it was, I think it was Alabama, we sent down Dean Rollwagon and various other people. They ran a pilot plant there for 6 months, looking for diamonds, looking for state government. So anyways, this capability was developed here, and it is still a huge capability. And so bringing us into about 2001, we were up to about 1,000 employees now with all these operations. I'm going on here, maybe too long. A company called SGS, which you know, they were a company that was in mining services, particularly labs, oil and gas services, again labs, agricultural services, primarily labs, and consumer products, trading, and they had these different divisions that they had. And they had difficulty in the late 1900s with their board, because it's part family and part board, and they had a balance sheet that was very bad. And what they did is they sold off 2 divisions and cashed out. They got $500 million. And because of the way they've been operating, they felt that the only way they could grow from this point on was through acquisition. And the first company that came after, whenever they got everything fixed, was Lakefield Research for the mining sector. So they had this mining sector, and they came to us. So they came to me in June of 2001, and I declined. I had lunch, but I did decline. I didn't want to go any further. But what transpired from there was, when we did the deal with ore test in Australia, what we did is a share transfer, and so the major owner of ore test, I don't know, had 70% or so of the company, ended up owning 9% of us. And subsequently, he was trading on the Australian Stock Exchange, and subsequently, but he was investing in pension plans into non-liquid assets like private companies, so he couldn't get cash. So he decided to close down his fund and go off the market, and decided he wanted to sell everything. But he didn't talk to us ahead of time, but SGS did. And so he brought SGS into our board in September of 2001. And they made an offer for the company. And at that time, this was not my vision to sell the company. It was my vision to grow the company. But I made a few mistakes. One mistake was not looking after liquidity for some of the shareholders. Just to repeat, maybe going back, when we did this management buyout, we brought in senior management, but then we brought in, the next year we brought in maybe 15 more employees, then we brought in 15 more employees, and by the time we get to 2001, we had about 80 employees that are owners of Lakefield Research. And so, so in doing that now, we had people, after this number of years, their vision is also cash, to have, and so when they made this offer for the company, I knew then it was over because, I knew it, but I didn't let on it. But because there was no way we could match the offer, and there was no way that, at that time in 2001, 2002 was when the downturn occurred. There was no way we could match that. So we also had 1,000 employees, and we had a fair amount of payroll too, and so we had to make sure this company continued to operate. So eventually, through very tough negotiations, and I would say it was very tough, and very ups and downs. I always call it a roller coaster. We eventually closed the deal in April 2002. So the deal was, but what we did at that time was, okay, we decided, they wanted us all to stay and to keep doing what we do, and they were going to fold in all their mining stuff into Lakefield Research and continue to build this company. Subsequently, what transpired, and so we issued shares back to ourselves. So we now are owners of our company again, and subsequently continue to grow it for the next 5 years. And we were internationally run from Lakefield, so we ran all our operations reported here to Lakefield. Just before the closing of the deal, SGS changed their CEO, and it's somebody you probably have heard of, Sergio Napioni, who's now the CEO of Fiat, CEO of Chrysler. He became the CEO of SGS, and so he became the other side of the table with me. So, anyways, and what he did is he brought in a person, a management consultant, and they decided to go away from this functional management, or like the mining division being run worldwide, to area management. So Australia runs Australia, Canada runs Canada, etc. And this was totally incongruent with the deal that we had, and totally incongruent with the way Lakefield had to be run, and we had all these legal deals anyways. So it created considerable organizational issues. So if I went into Chile, instead of having, I'd have the general manager of South America, the general manager of Chile, I'd have the accountants in Chile, and then I'd move over to Australia and all this. So it was very, very tough. And also we're still in the down period, so we're not producing a great deal of profit. But I have to say, Lakefield has always been profitable. So this structure in SGS created a situation. Mr. Marchione hated the deal, number one, and subsequently what we call ring fenced us. So instead of financing us, we could no longer grow. And so eventually, and we had board meetings up here. I don't want to tell you all about my board meetings, but there was 3 of us on our side, and there was Sergio and head of U.S., or head of North America, and the CFO from Geneva, and another. And we operated like this, not like a team. Anyway, so eventually, I made an offer to buy Sergio out in 2003, and he turned me down. And then he made an offer to buy us out in 2004. And it was the only way to go, because you have this big company, you have us. So Lakefield then became completely unencumbered and continued to grow again, and SGS had the financial backing to grow. And so it continued to grow from about 1,000 back to, I talked to Chris Fleming lately, and he thinks it's around 1,800 employees. It might be more, the old Lakefield. And if you look at some of the things we spun off, it's more. I'd say the sales now of Lakefield overall is probably over 100 million. And I think it's servicing about 50% of the mines now in the world. Diamonds, Mineralogical services is second to none. There's hydrometallurgical services, tremendous capability. It's the largest R&D organization in extractive metallurgy, so you look at the Incas of the world and others, BHP. I mean, we were even going to take over BHP's R&D at one time, because so you're talking several hundreds of metallurgists, engineers, and so on. Huge analytical capability. I think now Russ Keller is running about 50 labs. Now some of them were SGS labs and some were Lakefield labs. And doing all this exploration work around the world. Metals do not go away, they get recycled. And so recycling is becoming a huge area. And so all kinds of processes now are being developed for recycling metals. And so every recycle stream is different again. So Mother Nature put every ore body different, well, they put every recycle stream different too. And so again, it needs this process, and Lakefield Research is providing that kind of services moving forward. So in 2004, after we did that, I decided I didn't want to be the CEO further. So I decided to either be a consultant or, but at the same time, there's another company that we spun out of Lakefield. It's called Recaptured Metals. And so I'm just giving you a little more history here than maybe. But Recaptured Metals is a company that we started in Lakefield. We had about a 3,000 square foot pilot plant, and we saw all this capability that we had, and we're a service company, but producing metal is also quite interesting. And we looked at these high value metals. So like gallium is a metal that is about $400 a kilogram, let's say $400,000 a ton. Other metals like we're into rhenium, which is $4 million a ton, and indium, which is like $700,000 a ton. So anyways, so we saw that we had this vision of starting up, because these metals have to be recycled. And so we started up this gallium processing operation, and it was called Argento Plata. Argento is silver in Italian and Plata is silver in Spanish, so we called it Argento Plata to make sure it wasn't Lakefield Research. So we started this up, and eventually we also bought a plant in Napanee, Ontario. And but when we did the deal with SGS, we had to get off the site within a year. We wanted to be close to Lakefield because of all the capabilities here. So we decided to buy a plant in Peterborough. We bought a plant down in Neil Drive. And we moved the gallium recycling business there. So we built this business out, learning how to recycle gallium. And we started what is now called Recaptured Metals. At that time it was called Argento Plata, but we renamed it. And gallium is a metal that, so every one of your cell phones, every wireless instrument, it's in the power amplifiers and switches. So Blackberries, 3G phones, camera phones, anything with power and wireless requires gallium. And also LEDs. Every LED used to be either gallium phosphide, gallium nitride, or gallium arsenide. And subsequently now, there's substrates produced as gallium arsenide. So gallium is in every LED, and then all the new thin film solar, what we call copper indium gallium selenide, the new solar cells that are being developed is got lots of gallium in it as well. So we set this up in Peterborough, and this came out of Lakefield, and I moved there with Mark Tyndale, and some of the old management of Lakefield became owners of this company. So we became owners of this company, and the guy, Mark Tyndale moved there. He bought the plant, started there, but we were still back here, and I moved there as CEO in 2004. In 2005, we purchased a company in Blanding, Utah, which was called Recapture, and that's how we got the name. And it was recycling gallium in the United States and producing a tremendous product, had a worldwide renown, and subsequently we became the only recyclers of gallium in North America. In addition to that, we then moved on in 2006 to buying a primary gallium plant in Germany. It was the only one outside of Russia and China. And we, because of our belief that we didn't have the financial strength, we went in on a 50-50 joint venture, but we ended up owning this company in Germany. And so we became the #1 producers of gallium in the world in servicing this. Now Japan, there's 6 companies in Japan. They're all combined larger, but we were still #1 as a company. Anyways, gallium is continuing to grow, and I think it's a fabulous metal. It looks like mercury, and actually it melts at 29 degrees Celsius, and but it's non-toxic, and it's used in that kind of application. In addition to that, we started Indian recycling in Peterborough, again using all this extractive technology knowledge that you have. Indium is used in all your flat panels, so your high definition televisions, so plasma televisions and LCD. LCD is indium tin oxide, and that's 90% indium. And indium again is like $700 I think a kilogram right now. And the only way this business works is by recycling. There's not enough indium being produced in the world to keep this business going. So we started this up in our Peterborough plant. We're very small in the indium business. We're a fraction of 1 or 2% of the overall market at this time. But we're moving into the solar industry in helping recycle indium. The other metal that we started as well, this was in 2008, is rhenium. Rhenium is a metal that's used in the nickel cobalt superalloys and jet engines. So back about 1993 or so, Pratt Whitney, General Electric, and Rolls-Royce started moving to putting rhenium in these nickel cobalt superalloys in the jet engine. So in a jet engine you have 2 compartments. One is the compression department, and then you have the hot department where the burning takes place. And the whole key to these jet engines is getting hotter. By getting hotter, you reduce the amount of emissions into the greenhouse gases. So like methane and partially burned hydrocarbons produce a lot of greenhouse gas compared to carbon dioxide. Produces more power, more fuel efficiency. And so subsequently, the only way all these engines now, and every jet plane that you see depends on rhenium. And rhenium's in nickel cobalt superalloys, which is very difficult to recycle, and we developed a process, again, using our capabilities, and put a plant in our Napanee operation, which is now the only recycler of rhenium in North America. And we're working with General Electric, we've got Pratt Whitney and Adore, and so subsequently this is a huge, and it's very, very important to these businesses. I was at the aerospace conference in Pittsburgh 2 weeks ago, and all discussing of rhenium. I mean, how are we going to keep this engine business going without rhenium? And right now, there's only 70 tons produced in the world. About 45 is from what we call virgin production, and the rest is from recycle. And the superalloy recycling is just beginning. So it's declared a strategic metal by both Russia and U.S. But again, it requires all this technical capability to be able to do it. You can't just say, I'm going to get into rhenium recycling. You've got to have that knowledge. So we have guys like Joe Ferrone, I mentioned earlier, Chris Fleming, etc., helping develop these processes. Well, this brings it to another saga in this whole thing is we have been pursued in this business of recapture metals for at least 2 years by companies wanting to buy us. And again, this company I feel can be built bigger than even Lakefield, but it needs financial resources to do that. So we agreed to sell again back in last summer, July, and this time we closed the deal in August 31st, and we sold to a company called Neo Materials Technologies Inc. It's on the Toronto Stock Exchange. They're the 2nd largest producer of rare earths in the world. They have operations in China. Rare earths go into all your phosphorus and your lighting, goes into catalysts for your auto cats. And they also produce what's called neodymium iron boron powders. And this goes into the high disk drives of your computer. So almost every computer that you see probably has our iron, neodymium iron boron, which goes in to make a very strong magnet, goes into the computer. You know, new windshield wiper motors, car seat motors, everything that wants light is going to rare earth magnets. And anyways, but they wanted to build a division of rare metals, and saw us as the foundation for doing that. And so subsequently convinced us to join. So from going from a shareholder of recaptured metals, we became shareholders of new materials. And subsequently, we are looking at acquisitions now in Germany and United States and other places. So. Anyways, that brings us to the saga. Shelley, do you want to tell us anything about what's happened since 2004 at SGS?
Still a lot of growth. At our Lakefield site, I would say we have around 380 employees, spread out through the analytical minerals and environmental, mineralogy, diamonds, and metallurgy, mineral processing, gold, powder metallurgy, and with being part of SGS, our Lakefield site, we do manage all of the administrative part for all of Canada, which has around 1,200 employees for SGS. And so we do payroll and all human resources support out of the Lakefield office for all of SGS Canada. So it's pretty impressive. Yeah, it really is.
So,
Mr. Seeley, you'll entertain some questions for
Sure.
us?
Okay. All right. I went quite a bit, quite long here. I hope you don't mind. Didn't realize I'd go that long. But Shelley knows I'd go that long.
Are you allowed to tell us what part Lakefield Research had in the Bre-X affair?
I think so. I think, well, some of it's a little bit inside, but effectively when Barrick decided to move in there, we were the lab doing all the gold assays for Barrick. I think I can say this. It was Friday the 13th, December Friday the 13th. I was having a management meeting, and Mr. Callow came in. There's no gold in this. Well, you know, your heart just fell. I mean, I kind of felt there was something wrong with it. Anyways, so we scrambled around and tried to figure it out. So anyways, we go back to Barrick, and this is 13, so we're going to continue getting samples, we're going to continue analyzing, so maybe it's just a bad sample. So lo and behold, over Christmas, we start getting samples, and there's lots of gold. Okay. So I took a breather. So this is okay. But at the same time, see, we were only doing analytical work. We do work what we get paid to do. So we don't do work because we're interested or something else, because we just don't have enough, you have to get paid for what you do. So somewhere along the way, there was a decision made to start looking at this mineralogically. And subsequently, we started seeing that this gold doesn't fit this ore. This ore was a very, you might call it, should be a reducing environment, and this gold is an oxidizing environment, like it's in a river stream or something. Or, and in some cases, start finding electronic scrap. But anyways, then you might remember a big drilling process. People went in to drill. What's the name of the company again? It's a Toronto company. It was managed by a Toronto consulting geological company. And we became the Canadian lab, and you had an Australian lab, and you had a Thailand lab. And so subsequently, we were the Canadian lab. And these samples were handled, there was only one person in Lakefield who knew the results, that was Keith Sarver. He saw the numbers, no one else did, everything was coded. The results released on a Sunday, and I heard them. I knew that there was problems on Friday, but that's, so we were the Canadian lab that did the final assays, and then we did work on the mineralogy, and showing that this was a complete hoax. But you had to do the mineralogy to find that too, because you just can't can't do the analytical work, you have to do it too. So we were the Canadian lab. What was the problem at that time was whether, you didn't know what to do, because if you said this is a problem here, and it wasn't, the stock goes like this, you got a problem. So you don't know what to do. And anyway, so we had to work with the clients and make sure that, that's pretty much what happened over the years. But we were the Canadian.
Dr. C, a very rich and interesting story. Can you draw on your experience to comment on what Canada must do to have a competitive business environment for startups and young groups that might grow as well as you have?
Well, I think this is a huge, huge problem. In this case, we bought a company that was already functioning, and so we could grow from that, and that was very important to grow. Startups are very different. This company recaptured metals. What I lived through in Lakefield and growing up, I lived through double that in recapture in 5 years, as far as I'm concerned. I think I got older too. The problem is, it's all around financing. So banks are a non-risk finance, and that's what their mandate is. It's not to lend money to venture stuff. They are solid investments, put it into mortgages, houses, that kind of stuff. So you put your money in the bank, you've got it. So they're non-risk financiers, and they will only finance, so they're called what is senior debt, and very low risk. Their costs are lower, financing. So at Lakefield, let me give you an example of financing there. We had CIBC, very good relationship.